welcome to the third Premodern Korea lecture series. I'm Jisoo Kim, the Korea Foundation Associate Professor of History, International Affairs, and East Asian Languages and Literatures. I direct the GW Institute for Korean Studies and co-direct the East Asian National Resource Center. I'm so delighted to have Professor Soo-Jung Kim with us today. It's been such a long time that I've last met her in person, but it's so good to have her with us at GWIX at our Pre-Modern Korea lecture series. She's currently working on a fascinating topic, and I thought I had to invite her to our lecture series. Let me have the pleasure of introducing her first, and then I'll turn over the floor to Soo-Jung. All right. Dr. Soo-Jung Kim is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at DePaul University. She received her PhD. East Asia. Well, there's some sound issue. Okay. She received her PhD in East Asian Languages and Cultures from Columbia University in 2014, and her MA in Buddhist philosophy from Korea University in 2007. She specializes in Japanese and Korean Buddhism and is interested in tracing the interaction between Buddhist cultures using textual and material sources. After her first monograph, Shinra Myoin and Buddhist Networks of the East Asia Mediterranean, published by the University of Hawaii Press in 2019, she is currently working on her second book project titled Korean Magical Medicine, Healing Talismans in Chosön, Korea, which explores sociocultural, religious, and medicinal roles that paper talismans played in the everyday life of ordinary people in Chosön. And this project was supported by the ICLS Robert H. Ho Family Foundation in 2021 and 2022. Now, before I turn it over to Soo-Jung, I would like to mention that we have changed from a webinar format to a regular meeting since last series, since the last talk. And so this means that our audience can join us directly, turning on their video and ask questions. But if you prefer to use chat box, please use chat box to leave your questions, and I'll try to address them when I can. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Soo-Jung.
Thank you so much, Jisoo, for the invitation and also very generous introduction. I'm so honored to be here, part of this series. And also everyone, very nice to meet you. I see some of the audience. I know some of you I haven't met before, but I'm looking forward to any feedback or any questions that you have after I present my material that I prepared for this talk. So let me start with sharing my PowerPoints. I'm so glad that this is the not webinar format, so you can really feel free to use chat box, or even just stop me so that I can be more, hopefully more entertaining and more interactive. So let's see. Okay. The title is Wording of Woes, Epidemic Talismans in Chosön Buddhism. So what I like to do in this talk is to give you some ideas about what talismans is. So starting with a broader picture of what I do for this book project, but also a more bigger picture of how Chosön people dealt with epidemics, because we have very recent memories about the COVID, right? So. And my book project is in a way COVID baby, because when after I finished my first book, I was thinking or looking for some new book project, and that was when pandemic happened. And I thought this is a great timing to write about something about healing, so that it sells better. So this is the outline. I'm going to introduce why talismans, so that kind of give you some bigger picture about talismans, and then moving on to managing epidemics during the Chosön period. And then the third part is sort of the main sort of outcome of my recent research, which is I'm giving you 4 examples of Buddhist talismans, so that I will go through each one's examples and try to give you what those are and what functions they carried out and these kind of things. And then I will conclude. kind of moving here is better, I guess. So white talismans. The prim the, the, mm, the primary goal of my book, or going to be the soon going to be published, Korean magic medicine healing, Buddhist healing talismans in Chosön, Korea, is to understand what social, cultural, religious, medicinal, and material roles talismans played in the everyday life of people in Premodern Korea. And the book argues that one of the most profound and lasting imprints of Korean Buddhist practices was healing, and the healing talismans were paramount in sustaining Korean Buddhism during the Joseon period. Broadly defined as any tangible object believed to hold magical properties and powers, these talismans, or sometimes bu, or bujok, more known to Korean, modern Korean audience, bujok, were omnipresent in the everyday lives of Joseon Koreans. They were used for almost any worrisome occasions, such as sickness, poisoning, or even travel. Sometimes I encountered a talisman when you are locked outside, you want to open your door, right? So there's a talisman to open your door too. So pretty much every troublesome situations, people in Joseon used this thing called talisman. But among all these different talismans, what I'm interested in my research is healing talismans. So healing talismans doubly functioned as therapeutic and epitropic substances, were especially intertwined with the long-lasting Buddhist practice of healing and medicine. Buddhist priests were the leading prescribers of talismans, and Buddhist temples were the primary sites of the mass production of those talismans. Printed paper talismans are central to my research because of their exceeding popularity and prevalence among the various material forms that talismans could take. Heavily influenced by Chinese practice, Korean Buddhists imagine that talismans possesses the concentrated power of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. Moreover, the illegible signs adorning the visual surface of paper talismans were interpreted less as a command code or contractual pledge than as a physical manifestation of the divinity itself in its most esoteric form. Believers engage with talismans through various ritual actions, from wearing them. This is a very typical way to engage with talismans. So put in some part of your body, either the necklace or somewhere in your purse or some pockets. So from wearing them or performing chants, often talisman comes with another sort of prescribed sort of set of invocations or chanting sort of thing. So performing chants with them and to place them over affected body parts or even ingesting them. So often when I was studying healing talismans, there are still abundant of examples, but one major challenge in my research was often healing talismans were burnt. So, and then they drank the ashes for the healing purpose. So we don't have that many examples that I can use, but still there are some woodblocks, which I'm going to show you in a minute, and other like Buddhist texts that explains what is talisman and what is talisman should go with what kind of incantation. Those things will be still out there, so that's kind of helpful for me to write this book. Talismanic objects functioned as a miniaturized cosmic conduit through which medicinal, material, and performative aspects of writing were channeled to produce power. A close investigation of the individual talismans used in Chosön reveals how the rich history of Buddhist healing materialized in a specifically Korean local context, but also how it was related to the broader talismanic culture in Buddhist Asia. Previous scholarship has tended to decry talismans as a degenerative, superstitious, and un-Buddhist practice, something like a Buddhist or of Taoist or shamanic province. prevalence, sorry, such that the studies of talismans have remained all but invisible to scholars of Korean Buddhism so far. One of the challenging aspects of writing this book has been the lack of primary sources illuminating how these talismans were produced and utilized in the Buddhist setting. However, throughout my research, I could look at several Dharani texts containing Buddhist talismans, including a text that I'm going to explain in a minute. Other than obvious Buddhist sources, I also use other non-Buddhist materials, such as novels, encyclopedias, recipe books, and travelogues from often Western travelers who visited Chosön. All of this allows me to provide a holistic picture of the talismanic culture during Chosön. I also bring visual and material aspects of talisman to the front, highlighting how the materiality of talismans overcomes its ontological state and transforms itself into sacred and medicinal objects through ritual actions. So the material that I'm going to present is from my chapter 4, and I think the main point is I became very curious about how Chosön people dealt with these numerous occasions of pandemic or epidemics, and what kind of talismans were used to ward off these pandemics. Before we go to Chosön, I want to sort of start with a little bit big, and then I will zoom in further as we go. But this example is one sort of typical, there's so many, it's so hard to pick out one example, but this is one example from the sort of roughly corresponding to late Chosön period, 17th, 18th century, from Germany, where you see for the at the occasion of epidemic situation, people used these Christian Bibles. Christians in Germany used this image of the Jesus and Maria, and kind of verses from the the Christian Bible, and they folded it and put it in the their pouch or some purse. So they hoping that this kind of talismanic substance help them to avoid or kind of to be cured from the epidemic. When some visitors from Western countries, especially a French person whose name is Charles 19th century, when this guy traveled to Southern Korea, what he saw in Seoul or Hanyang back then was a lot of households posted this image. You may think it's kind of maybe tiger, but actually it's a cat. So what is interesting about this particular image, which is locally taken out by this French person, and then he wrote it travelogue. So that's why we know the actual image here. But what he thought this Charles thought interesting is, to some people thought when infected, they thought the symptoms felt like this is basically the cholera situation. So people thought the symptoms felt like the muscle pain caused by mouse's bite. So to expel these demonic mice, they post a picture of a cat, because cat attacks mice. So with that kind of correlative thinking, they posted this image of cats. So that's kind of one sort of example of how the typical household in Chosön late 19th centuries used this printed paper to ward off epidemics. Another aspect that I like to talk about is more bigger sort of non-Buddhist setting. Then we will move on to Buddhism. So in Chosön, epidemics increased in the Chosön was, as you know, mostly it's isolated country. So it's kind of hard to imagine how, epidemics such as cholera and smallpox and malaria, all these things happened. But so according to historical records, we know that epidemics did come, through various human, migration and, interactions, especially the war, after the Imjin War and then the Qing invasion and all these things. So epidemics increased in the 16th century and reached the pinnacle in the 17th century. And between the 17th and 19th century, more than 6 times of major outbreaks happened, then combine the other time periods, resulting in hundred thousands deaths. So for the Chosön government's point of view, this was a sort of very, like public health emergency situation. So what Chosön government did was, according to Shillok and other records, they compiled a lot of medical texts. So, and also in those medical texts or historical records, we see that commonly there are a couple of concepts or ideas were used, terms used to describe these epidemics. And one common one is 역, or sometimes 질, or more vernacular term is something like 연병. It's kind of, if you're a Korean speaker, the 연병 is kind of often used in a totally secular context in contemporary Korean word, but historically in Chosön, it meant epidemics. But one term that really is important for my study is on. On is another term that you see here. Both Chinese characters were used either with like water radical, or this is on the right hand side, this is the sickness radical. So it's kind of interchangeably used. So I'm going to explain a little bit more about what exactly on is. So what is on is very relevant because it's still found in the historical documents, but often medical texts uses its own the term, or 온병 sometimes, as the main sort of term for epidemics. And luckily, scholars such as Martha Hansen, this is her book on about this particular own disease in China. So speaking of epidemics in Chinese medicine, in it, Professor Hansen explains very detailed sort of biography of on, or one in Chinese. So there we have some better ideas about what on was perceived or conceptualized, eventually kind of separate as its own category. But to give you the gist of it, basically, it is heat-caused epidemic disease, or sometimes epidemics in general. Modern historians, especially Korean medical historians of medicine, try to sort of find a matching, biomedical term, modern biomedical term to know what exactly on is. But what is interesting about Martha Hansen's book is that without reducing on to something equivalent to like malaria or cholera, she tries to deal with on as it in its own term. So going back to Korean situation, Korean medicine, Oriental medicine was hugely influenced by Chinese medicine, traditional medicine. And so during the Ming period, we have better understanding of this worm disease, and Chinese physicians wrote a lot of medical texts, which helped Joseon physicians to understand these epidemics and how to deal with it. So remember 16th, 17th centuries, when this epidemic really became rampant in Chosön, Chosön government sponsored a series of sponsoring these medical texts, such as 벽원방 or 간이벽원방, something easy to be used, readily used at the, in the provinces and villages, or 분문 온역 이해방, right? 분문 is basically more comprehensible, easy to understand. So it's mostly for people really be able to use it in this epidemic situation. Or 신참벽원방, this is like the very well-known Chosön, right? The author of the 동의보감. He is also one who recently compiled this text, 신천벽은방, and then after that, 벽은 신방. All these things are basically those things that I like underlined, both in classical Chinese and also written in vernacular Korean, so that wide range of people could use this. And all of the text has this term on, right? So you kind of know that this on was often in the medical context or medical texts use this on as sort of equivalent term to epidemics. So a little more about epidemics, management of epidemics here. We know a lot about how elites, the rich people, the privileged people dealt with epidemics. But often epidemics, since after people experience series of, this deadly catastrophic havoc, they decided to maybe two-way methods. One is preventative. So this like medicine or even later talismans that I'm going to talk about are often used both as a preventative measure, but also when you actually got infected, they use for the same substance to be cured. One common thing that we see in the Chosön records is 벽온단, which is could be a powder form, could be a pill, but red color. So usually red color in religion often symbolizes exorcistic, or like you can expel evil spirits with this bright red color, because ghosts do not like those kind of colors. So very likely a mineral such as cinnabar was used to create this like a small pill. And what they did was carrying around, or sometimes you can consume it, or you can burn without consuming, and especially on New Year's days. So for instance, like King Jongjo, we have very clear records about the Neiwon, or the Office of Royal Physicians. King Jongjo ordered the Neiwon to make 230 pills of 벽온단, and then he kind of, gave to these 5 pills to each of his close subjects as sort of customary thing for the king, the ruler, to take care of his subjects. But also this is one common example of the elite response. What about people who were not having this high elite status? How do you deal with this? Maybe I should close this so that I see a little better. So there is several, we don't have that many records to know how exactly people like us, right? Everyday people dealt with epidemics. But thanks to some visitors, again, Western visitors, so late Chosön, 19th century or so, we know that not exactly how epidemics were dealt with, but some more general ideas about how talismans were viewed and how Buddhist practices such as chanting were seen by these Western travelers. So for instance, she's very well known, Isabella Bird. After she married this Mr. Bishop. So her name also sometimes is Isabella Bird Bishop. She came to Korea 4 times between 1894 to 1897. So the last year after her fourth visit, she wrote this book called Korea and Her Neighbors. And in it, we hear this sort of her anecdotes. I quote, "Great reliance is placed on the charms which the pansu, which is the shamanic male shamans, make and sell. Probably there are few adults or children who do not wear these as amulets." So I kind of highlight here, kind of this, let us kind of understand it was very prevalent wearing amulets or talismans. They are generally made in the form of insects or consist of Chinese characters. They were written on specially prepared yellow paper in red ink and are regarded as being efficacious against illness and other calamities. Amulets are made of the wood of trees, like date tree, I guess, struck by lightning, which is supposed to possess medical qualities. So this is what Bird observed. I have one more. Another very important or well-known missionary from 19th century, late 9th century, James Gale. A lot of you probably know he's the one who, one of the earliest missionaries from, this one is from Canada, who also translated partially the first Korean Bibles, and also wrote dictionaries, first Korean English dictionary. Anyways, he also translated a lot of other Korean literature, but he also wrote this book called Korea in Transition, which was published in 1909. And in it, he says, I quote, "No Buddhist priest was admitted within the walls of Seoul for 500 years. And even today, the Confucianists uses the lowest and most disrespectful forms of speech to the Buddhists wherever he meets him. Yet, in times of trouble, as when no son is born, heir of the family, or when worries or anxieties beset the palace, there come calls on the Buddha and requests that his priests pray. Many a time have these seasons of prayer kept the writer awake at night." The writer means James Gale, "at night. Om Chari Churi Chunje Sabaha, Om Mani Padme Hum, Om Mani Padme Hum." So the last two are two different sort of Buddhist incantations, apparently very popular. One is for Bodhisattva Chunje or Chundi, or the other one is for another well-known Bodhisattva whose name is Kwanum or Avalokiteshvara. So now let's get to the juicy part. So what I try to so a little bit before we go to the Chosön period, we have some more active evidence, very visible evidence from the Goryeo period, especially late between 12th century to the 15th centuries. We have very active governmental support program, such as sutra lecture in Korean Panyadoryang, or sometimes we also have records of public reading ceremony. So Buddhist monks were invited either to the temple or to the palace, or this second one is basically carrying sutras and in the palanquin and incense burning. So it's kind of more public parade thing happening as a way to prevent to be affected by the epidemics. So for instance, the first one, Panyadoryang, was basically using this particular Buddhist text, a little bit long, Mahaprajna Paramita Sutra, was known to be very efficacious for epidemics, according to the text itself. So that was one main reason we had this kind of sutra lecture. And so that's kind of one bigger, more organized Buddhist response with the state support. But the other interesting thing that we have to sort of thinking about how Chosön people dealt with epidemics is a lot of people die, right? So that, and in Buddhism or in Premodern thinking, those dead people can come and haunt us. So you have to make sure that the dead people, there, not come across and come and mess with us. So things like 수륙제 or waterland ritual was very prominent Buddhist ritual that was, still very vibrant, and the Chosön, all the Chosön government still sponsored that in a more official manner. But after 15th century on, this was a little bit more replaced, not completely, but we see more sort of general trend of Confucian ritual take over this previous Buddhist sort of way to commemorate or try to appease this sort of potentially vengeful spirits, those people who died from the epidemics. And we call those Confucian rituals yeoje. And yeoje was often performed in the capital, but also in different provinces in Chosön. Now, this is really central for our today's discussion. This text, this image that you saw here is from Japan, from the 13th century, currently stored at Harvard Museum. But the text itself is from I think this is apocryphal, which is the Chinese invention, Chinese indigenous texts, very likely a Tang period text composed by some group of unknown people. But basically, this text called Incantations Against Epidemics taught by the Buddha, or it's kind of long, 불설 전종각 온황 신주경 in Korean, but it's kind of long, so from now on, I'm going to abbreviate as a 신주경. So I'm going to explain the contents in a minute, but now you know that this text is very influential for later Buddhists after Tang period on in China, Korea, Japan. This was very influential texts for the birth of this particular talisman that I'm going to talk about here. So what you see in this is the last page of one edition of the text that I just mentioned. This is Epidemic Talismans. And this one that you see here is, we have the title of or name of this talisman called the 불설 벽온부. And here we have Korean, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Maybe I just tell you now. 이 부작을 참여한 연병 which is epidemics, right? 부침하고 악기가 소멸하니라. So I translate this same idea a little bit longer in Chinese, classical Chinese. This is a talisman to ward off a plague. If one uses the talisman and memorizes and recites its incantation, all the evil spirits will disappear, and all diseases and sufferings will disappear forever. And the incantation is Om Chirim. So this is kind of interesting. So this particular talisman is one of the most recognizable or visible epidemic talismans. So this is example one that I thought interesting to look at. That is, I didn't expect that. But so I give you a little more information about this particular talisman, because when I say talisman, some of you have some ideas about how it's supposed to look like. And often we have more sinograph or Chinese character based, still very illegible, but you kind of see certain words, right? Like gui or gui in Korean, like demons. But this one doesn't look like those talismans that you probably know of. It's very different, right? So this is actually very likely still coming from China, but much more diverse, or fusion of different Buddhist traditions. So this particular way of writing is called kutakshara, meaning hip syllables in Sanskrit. So this thing, like the first one, some of you recognize this is Vindu, but we are talking about Indic languages, okay? And so there's a language or script called Lanjanya or Lancha script. So this is basically Lancha script, which is developed around 11th century to write Sanskrit. And especially this script was more keen about how to capture the sacred sound, the sonic aspects. So, and this particular script, Lanjanya script or Lancha script, was very well used in China or Korea, in Korea and Chosön Buddhism too. So if you have been to like Korean temples, there are usually you see bronze bells, right? And then on it, often inscriptions has this kind of very Lancha scripts. Or if you visit Buddhist temples, there are like often Buddhist temples have these tiles, roof tiles, and not every, but often you see some very like Om kind of thing. Om, you probably have heard that syllable, but there are a lot of these Lancha scripts used in Chosön as well. But what is interesting about this particular talisman is it uses different syllables of that this particular script, and they stack vertically, just as this one. So this one, what you see is a very famous in Tibetan Buddhism, this monogram or mantra monogram basically stacks 8 different syllables vertically, and also visually very interestingly interlocked. So this one is Kalachakra Sid Mandala fixed syllable. But the whole idea behind it is basically the sonic quality was materialized in a highly visual or decorative form to represent the sonic body of the deity. And it was once it is used this way, it was also used as a talisman. And this is how we know this 벽원부 or epidemic talismans were used. Now I have a second example, which is 단원진원. Again, same idea, cutting off, right? I don't know, how can I move this? Oh, here, okay. 단원진원, which is incantation for to cut off or to ward off epidemics. This is one of the earliest examples. It's not coming from Chosön. I couldn't find any Chosön usage of this one, but judging from the late Korea had this, it's very possible that Chosön people may have known about this image as well. So this particular one that you see is coming from mid 14th century. And this example is coming from Amitabha Buddha at Munsusa Temple in Chosön, Chungcheong province. So this particular one was excavated in 1973. So I don't know, many of you already know about this term, 복장, but if I give you some little background, so it's when you create Buddhist statues, you want to, this is not just, you know, material representation of the Buddhas or Bodhisattvas. It's actually the, you know, Buddhas and Bodhisattvas resides. So to do that, you have to sort of animate these recently created Buddhist statues or paintings. So in Buddhist Asia, they kind of came up with this ritual called consecration ritual. So in Chosön period, we have a lot of examples of, you know, so-and-so Buddhist statues. Once you open it, you see a lot of like objects were enshrined in it. And those are called 복장 ritual, sort of animating these Buddhist statues. And among all these different things, we often find printed sort of dharani or talismans too. So this 단원진원 is basically one example of this, how Chosön, or maybe Korea people more to be exact, use this particular incantation, printed incantation, used as if it's a talisman. So here, if you see this paper on we have three different things going on. The very top, we have the dharani of the Chundi, the one that I just mentioned in Gail's, you know, quotation. We saw this Bodhisattva, very popular one in Buddhism, in Chinese Buddhism, later on in Chosön Buddhism. So there is kind of a very elaborated dharani of this particular Bodhisattva. The middle one, I couldn't figure out what it is, so we can skip that. And the third one, this, you know, sort of votive panel. Also, within that, we have several things going on here. But here, when you see the yellow parts, what we see here is a 단원진원. So we know that this one is 단원진원, and on the also the text below here, we see some excerpt from some sort of story, but basically it talks about why we get you know, epidemics, and the cause is the thing called 7 plague demons, and it explains how to invoke the power of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas and then expel the 7 plague demons. And these 7 demons are coming from the text that I introduced earlier. So going back to this text, incantations against epidemics taught by the Buddha, or 신주경, if I shortened, the main plot is quite simple, very short text. As you see, it starts from here and ends here. It's dialogue, very typical Buddhist text dialogue between Ananda, one of the Buddha's disciples, and the Buddha. And at the time, sometime in India, in Vaishali, epidemic occurs, and then Ananda asks the Buddha, according to the story, and how to expel this epidemics. And Buddha says, oh, there's just such a thing called the 7 plague demons. And if you, so in a lot of esoteric context, recognizing the cause, the name of the evil things is really the key. So Buddha gives the name of these 7 plague demons, and then he also further instructs reciting the names and writing the names of the 7 plagues, carry it or paste it on the wall, will help them with the power of Buddhist faith. That can be the best method to ward off epidemics. So I already explained some very popular from Tang period on. In Korea, we know the earliest edition of these texts is from the late Goryeo period. It was stored at the temple, Haeinsa Temple. You probably know Haeinsa Temple in Hapcheon is the place where we have this thing called Buddhist canon, Tripitaka Koreana. So we have this official sort of Buddhist canon stored at some point at the Haeinsa Temple. But Haeinsa Temple also stores other sort of locally produced Haeinsa Temple produced woodblocks, and this particular text is found in those non sort of canonical sort of section. But what happens is early 20th centuries, this lay Buddhist Pak Sung-muk, he went to some like waterland ritual in capital, and he met this very sort of mysterious Buddhist monk, and the monk said, oh, when I went to Haeinsa Temple, I saw this incredible text that we can expel epidemics. So after hearing that, Pak Sung-muk went to Haeinsa Temple, and he basically asked the Buddhist monks to have a copy of it. So with that, he basically made a Korean vernacular translation. So this one again that we see is Pak Sung-muk's help. He, with somebody's help, he translated the text into Korean, and this is what you see is the very end of that Pak Sung-muk's edition. And currently it's housed at the Gyujanggak Library. This is another example, just, right, if you see this featuring this particular talisman that we talked about so far, and on the left hand, it's kind of reversed, so that when you actually put a paper and then put some red ink, and then you see the opposite mirror image of that. But what you see is the name of the 7 plague demons. And in the middle, we see that the talisman that I talked about so far. So this is the third example that I'm introducing you. So there was this one individual ones that we talked about, but this one is more about sort of a collective collage kind of thing. So again, this is, I'm presenting the Goryeo example because this particular example became the model for later Chosön people's use of this large set of talismans. So in it, we have 18 talismans, all listed after short Dharani texts. And here you see talisman ontebu. And this is basically, these ones that we see is what I meant, like sinographic based, Chinese letter based talismans. And if you see, it's kind of seal shaped, right? So that is one example of probably in my book, one chapter I also kind of have dedicated to this kind of more larger set of Buddhist talismans. We see both, one individual talisman for one particular healing purpose, but we also see more in the multi-purpose, cure for all, or, like a solution for all kind of, idea was embedded when people were using this many different talismans used without much clear logic behind, but know that this particular one, and we have some other examples in the Goryeo period. This is found in the inside of the Avalokiteshvara statue, and we have also here the ontebu, the talisman used against epidemics. So this is from the Chosön example. So this is what I meant really about the bigger sort of almost mandalic representation of different talismans. According to my research, roughly around the 16th centuries, we see this 24 talismans becomes one set and repeatedly carved and printed and circulated. So we see the one prominent example currently stored at the Handok History of Medicine Museum in South Korea. So on the left, you see the woodblocks, and on the right-hand side, this particular one is currently in France, but know that this is the typical example of how the Chosön people use talismans, but in it we have one talisman dedicated to the epidemics. So just give you one idea. These are the 24 talisman, name of each talisman, and here disease-free and longevity talisman is always included in that 24 set that was used widely for many different occasions. We have the last example. This is again sort of going back to the first example, right? We have very akshara, more like a diagram like talismans, and we have now including 1, 2, 3, 4, and then there's another one. This is Sakayore Wahabu, another sort of talisman, but the 5 of them, and then up here we have another sort of this is actually another very prominent talisman. One of my book chapters solely dedicated to this particular talisman. But all of this, what you want to know at this point is all of this up here and then down here are somehow loosely connected to this bodhisattva whose name is Kwanum or Kwanseum or Avalokiteshvara. And so probably that's why we have in this particular example on the left-hand side, we see Kwanum Bujak. And it has many, efficacies, right? The first one is that you see here, this is also, it's preventative for epidemics, right? So this kind of, but there are some totally unrelated efficacies also listed here too. So this is on the right-hand side, you see the woodblocks, not for this one, but we know that in early 20th century, we have some of these more locally produced sort of collage of talismans that were used for epidemic situation. So putting all together, my study suggests lesser known aspects of social roles that Buddhist temples played in Chosön on top of those talismans that we talked about, right? How Buddhism really provided connection with the everyday Chosön people's piety. So often people, when you think about temples, right? There are certain things are known, such as the first one, like this one that you see is the temple library of the Hapcheon Hainsa temple, right? And we know that not all, but major monasteries such as Hainsa was the main repository of xylographs, woodblocks, right? And they contain the teachings of Buddha, right? That's kind of one of the main reasons of the public roles that Buddhist temples performed throughout the history of Buddhism. But on top of that, people often forget is Buddhist temples, again, not every, but a lot of majority of them were having some sort of infrastructure to be able to print. So as you know, like Buddhists use a lot of these wood blocks to basically disseminate Buddha's teachings. So they had a lot of knowledge, accumulated knowledge from Korea all the way to Chosön to print those things. But often people think that, oh yeah, Buddha's teaching, so very prominent, Buddhist texts, some sutras, Lotus Sutra, Diamond Sutra, but also from my research, what I like to highlight is there are also a lot of Dharani texts, and those Dharani texts Not all, but many of them have some incantations for various mundane purposes, very, immediately ready to use those incantations or talismans. So those temples they were the main producers of these kind of talismans. And also, if you think about all the examples that I presented so far, they are the preservers. They were the one who circulated this particular form of healing knowledge. And also through this kind of talismanic efforts, they are the one who more connected to the everyday people's religious lives than you may think. One more example to support my argument is recently there were several sort of attempts to survey what we have in the temple archives, right? In the 1987, there was led by this scholar Park Sang-guk, that a group of people did all sort of nationwide survey, went to different temples and gathered all these wood blocks, not really organized, some are, like disposed, some are corrupted or broken. But anyways, we have several sort of those attempts. So most recently, 2020, we completed, or we have some better understanding of what those wood blocks are, and and what kind of major texts or what kind of temples were engaging in this kind of producing wood blocks. And Songgwangsa in Suncheon and Hapcheon Haeinsa that we talked about are definitely two major temples from Korea to late Joseon throughout, very consistently. Also, Boyeonsa Temple currently in North Korea was another major printing workshop. And from the 11th century all the way to the 20th centuries, we have very evenly distributed, production of Buddhist temple, Buddhist sutras, Buddhist texts. And surprisingly, we have also a large number of wood blocks that was used to produce talismans. So here's my conclusion. In his book, Plagues and People, William McNeil suggests a correlation between the epidemics and the spread of religion. Was the use of the Buddhist talismans helped strengthening beliefs in Buddhism among the Chosön commoners? I want to say yes, and maybe, but I hope that this example that I've shown you maybe give you some ideas to think about, the common narratives of Chosön Buddhism being not really doing much. We have some couple of major eminent monks left some things, and we have some better understanding now. So, as you know, the more earlier Korean Buddhist scholarship tend to present, Confucian dominance and Buddhism sidelined, but newer scholarship now tries to sort of not totally overturn, but try to emphasize, Buddhism was not as bad as you thought. But I think my examples gives one step further, take you to the more proactive position of the dynamical interactions of Buddhism, how Buddhism really stayed, strong and connected with everyday people's concerns, and how Buddhist temples functioned in this social context. So rich extant examples of Buddhist talismans suggest the epidemics expose not only the weakness of the society, but also multiple layers of coping mechanisms, such as collective use of talismans and healing, faith-based healing, such as those talismans that I've shown you so far. I think that's all what I have prepared for today. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have, and thank you for your attention. If I haven't really responded to all your questions, here's my email address, so feel free to email me after the talk. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that fascinating talk. I learned so much. All right, we can open up for questions. So again, please feel free to just directly ask your question to Sujang, or you can leave your questions in the chat box as well. While we're waiting to receive questions, maybe I can start by asking you first question. So I was wondering, what's this relationship with shamanism?
Ah,
So, because when you of course in contemporary practice, when we think about pujak, it's the shamans who kind of give you pujak. Although I mean it's also related to uh, um, Buddhist. Because in Isabella Bird's bishop's quote that you gave, I think it does mention about male shaman. So I was just wondering if you could elaborate on its relationship with shamanism at the time.
thank you so much for the question. So, and that has been really a big sort of question mark for me too, the exact nature of shamanic use of talismans. And often, so Korean people who kind of know about Bujak or, kind of, it kind of appears a lot if you are Koreanist or Chosonists, right? In Choson novels, it's the kind of essential item. Or if I watch Korean TV dramas on Netflix, almost, always you see some sort of, I just can remember all the names of the TV shows that I've seen, but there's so many examples, right? And often we see sort of shamanic context, right? But what I try to mention here is more from religious scholars' point of view, or people who are more interested in sort of earlier practice. We also have very strong Taoist influence in making or preserving this talismanic knowledge. So before I go to the shamanic part, I maybe want to kind of the historical or kind of how Buddhist, Taoist, and shamans and other new religion. By the way, when like Jungsangyo or Cheondogyo or other that 19th century, early 20th centuries religious leaders started new religions, they often claim, the leaders often claim that they had healing powers, and they often use talismans too. So we have very rich examples of, different religious, individuals use this thing for their to advance their agenda. Well, so Taoist, so previously scholars in Sinology thought talismans come from Taoist tradition. It's kind of Chinese character and the incantation and all these things. But like scholars like James Robson in his seminal article 2008, Signs of Power, he makes very clear that too. Or before that, there's another scholar, Michel Strickman, but he and James Robson make it clear that probably it's not that useful to make that kind of separation, like Buddhist talisman and Taoist talisman. James Robson's point is very clear that probably the more useful one is, because the reason is they borrowed each other a lot all the time. So that labeling this is this and this is such is kind of in a way misleading. So that's kind of one question that always back in my mind too. But I often hear Jesus' question too from a lot of people who are very familiar with talisman culture in Korea. What about shamans? So I couldn't really find exact historical link of how Korean shamans use this particular thing that we know. But I guess I know kind of I say that I don't know in a very long way. But yeah, definitely what I try to also try to achieve in my book is a lot of scholars who are interested in talismans try to see the interaction between Taoism and Buddhism. But my suspicion is that we do not have in Korea, Taoist culture was very strong, had a lot of influences. And at some point in Chosön, we had institution too, right? But unlike Buddhism, Taoism didn't have consistent institutional support to carry out this knowledge, incantation, talismans. So that at some point, I think, became more available to those group of people that we call later shamans or 경사 or 법사. In late Chosön, we have a lot of these individuals who have some knowledge about reading or exorcism, 경사, 법사, right? And those people eventually have some sort of shared this idea of talismanic writings. But those are very distinctive. If you look at those examples, shamanic talismans or those, non-Buddhist, we can really see from the visual representations how Buddhist talismans look, how they look like, or what kind of characters they usually use, and how shamans prefer. And often shamanic talismans have a lot of similarities with what we call Taoist talismans.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you. I mean, I'm sure there are not enough sources actually to really, to answer this question. But yeah, thanks for your response. That was helpful. I think we got some questions here on chat. Maybe I'll start with Mark Tokola's question, because I also had this question as well. Did efficacy make a difference? Did Buddhism receive more or less support depending on whether epidemics because it's better or worse?
If I understood the question correctly, did efficacy make a difference? Yes, I think short answer to the question is yes. But as you know, what is interesting is we have different types of, I already shown you 4 examples, right? But in other cases, like another one example, one chapter that I write is about delivery, like give a birth. And for different, medical sort of isolated cases, we have more than one talismans, which means probably people wanted to, make sure that this thing works, right? In other words, something didn't work. So we have different viable options. And if this thing doesn't work, and then you go to the next one, right? So yes, definitely a short answer to Mark's question is yes, efficacy. And there are a lot of taboos were also need to be observed to make one, but also those people who carries talismans, there are certain things that you have to do bodily practice to make sure that efficacy stays. So yeah, definitely that was the big part of the picture.
Okay, thank you. Next question we have from Alira Sarfati. She asked about, could you expand a bit more about the differences in meaning and value between woodblock printed talismans and hand-drawn ones?
Good to see Alira here. She's a shaman in the shamanism expert, so maybe should ask her. But yes, that is excellent question. So talismans can be actually drawn in many different medium. Like Taoist masters, they even use the space, the air. They write characters in the space, right? But I'm in my work, I'm mostly exclusively focusing on the printed talismans, woodblocks, because what I've been interested in is more about mass production, because when you have printed like mediums such as woodblocks, you have unlimited way to not totally unlimited, but large mass production is possible. But what she's asking is another sort of common representation of contemporary Koreans' use of talisman is, when you have some troubles, your husband or, your children have all the sorts of problems, you very likely go to see a shaman, and then shaman usually perform some whatever rituals, and then with the spirit's help, he or she writes, right? So she's talking about that kind of writing aspects to it. And again, probably the value. So in Buddhism, what is interesting about mass-produced talisman is the copied is as equally authentic as the original, if that makes sense. right? So it's kind of, we understand in this digital world, right? There's no really copies. Copies still, right? Carries the same quality and same value. So what I like to sort of think about here is, some may think, right, more eminent monk or more well-known shamans write and charge like 5,000 US dollars. That probably has more, capital values than, other cheaply made talismans from Amazon, right? Or coupon in coupon on coupon website, you can even buy all sorts of talismans too. But what is interesting here is, at least in the pre-modern context, there was not so much difference in terms of its value. The way that it is created is definitely very different, but I don't think there was huge difference, if that answers your question.
Thank you. So next two questions, we have COVID related questions. So on the chat, we have a question from Santiago Ravello. He asks about, are these talismans still in use in modern Korean faith healing or superstitious beliefs? And this topic makes me think of the Amabie fad of Japan at the height of the coronavirus. Did these talismans see an increase in popularity during COVID as well? And I think you can also take Brendan DeCoster's question because they're related. So I wonder how you feel about the miracle cures peddled during the height of COVID. What similarities did you notice?
Thank you so much, Santiago and Brendan. Yes, this is fascinating questions. And I am aware of this Amabie thing that, so I often say that, during the COVID, people not only wear a mask, but they also wear a talisman. So when pandemic hit, you may think Christians are free from this kind of thing, but they do too. So, in Yeouido, in Seoul, there is this large, it's kind of listed as one of the largest, Buddhist church, 순복음교회, like the church of this Pentecostalism, I think. One of the pastors during the COVID created kind of like name card sized talisman for his Christian followers. And he wrote something on it, like, if you have this, possess this card, or he didn't say talisman, but if you possess this card, carry around, you will be exempt from COVID. And he was very, very popular, but eventually became controversial. So yes, it's not just Buddhist provenance. It's used in especially this kind of emergency situations or things that beyond our control, right? So that medicine doesn't work, quarantine doesn't work, then you have to rely on certain things, right? And COVID, at least in the beginning of that, when everyone was panicked about how to deal with it. So there is definitely some creative ones kind of made interesting move and then created this thing called talismans. But as I said in the very beginning of the presentation, regardless of religion, but also regardless of time and space, if you look at like Islam, if you look at Judaism, all the Judaism, so many examples. If you just take out Judaism or Islam, you have very similar. For instance, like on other occasions, that talismans were used in this kind of level is like war. When you are put into the war as a soldiers, either you die or alive, but wounded, right? So this kind of very precarious situations. In Chosön, in the 18th century, 19th centuries, we have examples of this cotton armor for the soldiers. But to have some sort of peace of mind, they printed those talismans, 18 or 24 that I'm showing you, right? So those things were printed on the soldiers' armor, and eventually those people, especially Americans during the Sinmiyangyo, they saw this is very interesting. Not only cotton armor, but having all this, talismans and incantations. So some of the examples are now in Britain, some of them are in Smithsonian Museum and the Metropolitan Museum of New York, in New York. So we have a lot of those things. But same thing happens in like early modern Islam too. So we see Islamic use of talisman for the same occasion. So I know I kind of drifted a little bit here. But going back to Santiago's question, in modern Korean faith feeling, superstitious belief. So that's kind of what I tried to, maybe I didn't do a good job. I don't want to say talismans are fake or superstitious, right? And totally religious healing, faith-based healing. It has that kind of aspects too. But we also have to think about, at least in the Buddhist context, and from my examples, not necessarily this epidemic talismans, but other examples that I studied in my research for this book it's not totally faith-based either. So they had some ideas. They had these Buddhists who created this kind of talismans. They were not all, but often they were well aware of some ancient Ayurvedic Indian, healing methods. And they were also communicated with like Chinese traditional medicines. So those methods exclusively found in Chinese medical texts. Also, sometimes we find some reminiscence or some sort of repercussion of that ideas in Buddhist texts. So like, for instance, in like the safe childbirth talisman that I study a lot, when you drink, so you have this talisman, but when you drink, when first you incinerate the talisman and then you put the ashes in the water, but it's not just random water. It's kind of, in a way, ritually processed, or sometimes you have sort of other medicinal substance, in the water, so that you are sort of hoping not only the powers of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas, but also some medicinal or therapeutic knowledge is also embedded in talismanic practice. So that's kind of what I try to show in this book project. And yes, talismans are prevalent everywhere in Korea now. Did I answer the questions? I hope.
Yeah, thank you. I think we have more questions in the chat, so I think we can move on. Next question from Leah Berzicki. Sorry if I'm pronouncing your last name wrong, but how much would folklore beliefs and practices influence talisman usage, possibly in regards to mountain gods and so forth, often seen on Buddhist temples and paintings?
Ooh, yeah, this is another sort of out of my expertise, but yeah, so this is kind of another big folk beliefs, right? Practicing for the talisman usage. Mountain gods. What I want to say at this point is a lot of these questions we have, right? Like the relationship between folk religions and Buddhism, or people's, late Chosön people's engagement with talismans. We need some more textual evidence to say anything concretely. So, but what I'd like to redirect the question is probably like going back to the second image that I've shown you, like the cats, right? You may think this is folk beliefs and, kind of without much institutional sort of knowledge, people use this kind of circulation of sort of ideas. But for instance, the cat talisman that I've shown, I did some more digging about why cat, And when you think about Sanshin, for instance, Sanshin is typically portrayed as an old man riding a tiger, right? And because we have certain animals associated with sort of Korean sort of folk religion. But I want to say that that kind of essentialist approach can be a little bit more carefully assessed. In other words, like claims such as, shamanism being Korean native religion, or Sanshin being, or Sanshingak, the mountain spirit hall being very characteristics of Korean religion. Those claims can be sometimes can be misleading to understand really like what's really happened on the ground. I'm not, making a big argument or claim here, but what I try to suggest is something comes from somewhere. Okay, so going back to the cat talisman, it was used for cholera, right? And if you go to Edo period Japan, there are also cholera-e, which is paintings of cholera. And in it, we have tiger. So same tiger is, depicted as a sort of demonic presence or sort of doing of this cholera disease. So that's one example that we see in a more or less contemporaneous period. But also in the southern part of China around that time, roughly late Chosön, if you go to China, if you really zoom out what's going on in other neighboring countries, people who did sericulture, like basically making the silk sericulture, those farmers use image of cats to make sure that they have abundance in their sericulture production. And we have plenty of image of cats being pasted on those. So it's very different context, right? One is same color, the other is very different. But all of these three examples, we see very similar thing, right? Cat or tiger being used as a sort of apotropic image, right? So those are kind of what I'm more interested in, instead of trying to say which one influenced which, but more trying to see the scale up version. Maybe we can see something in a different angle rather than stuck with this idea of Buddhism influenced folk religion or folk religion influenced Buddhism in Korea, right? I hope that answers your question.
All right, we have a few more questions. Next from Marina Valente. She's asking about whether it's also in private diaries of Confucian scholars. So about popular medical practices, and she's thinking of Yui Chun's well-known Mian Ilgi. Have you found any private diaries mentioning and describing epidemics, talismans during Chosön? If so, which ones?
Yes, thank you, Marina. Yes, I am. Wait, see, Yu Hui Chun. I do not know this particular one example, but in my study, I do use a lot of Confucian writers mentioning of these epidemics or healing talismans. For instance, Soyugu is one who wrote this massive encyclopedia, and in it he kind of even puts actual images of talismans. This is not healing, but when you travel, he has this talisman called Sungsanbu, so that you supposedly carry that to avoid any dangers. Or Cheongdae Ilgi is another sort of Confucian scholars 18th century record, tells us that this temple called Daesungsa in Gyeongbuk province, that's actually used as a quarantine place when epidemic happened during the Joseon period. So often, those things are mentioned in passing, right? Or in a very not a fully descriptive manner. So we have very small bits of information here and there, but at least this example, Cheongdae Ilgi, we know that certain temples, people went there as a way to avoid epidemics. And then he also goes on to say like how the Buddhist monks provided food and lodging to those people who were displaced. So yeah, those sources are very useful for me. And we know that kind of very sort of dual engagement of these Confucian scholars, right? Of this thing called Buddhism or even talismans.
Thank you. So AK and Laurel Victoria Gray shared about talismans in other contexts, in Ottoman Turkish armor, and I think you can read that in the chat, but we have a few more questions to get to, so I'd like to get to that first. Pierre Emmanuel Roux asked about whether some of your Buddhist talismans mention the epidemics against which they are used for. For instance, cholera was probably the major epidemics in the 19th century. Do you know any talisman explicitly related to cholera?
Thank you. Let me just reread. Yes. So I couldn't find. So this question is in a way kind of slightly undermine my argument, right? Because we have this impulse, modern impulse to know exactly this epidemics was this epidemics, right? So but in the historical records, it is not always clear. People have some symptoms, diarrhea, fever, and all these things. So we later on scholars kind of imagine that that was cholera, but so it's kind of very, in a way, the question slightly can be reframed to really think about how pre-modern people engage with this talismanic practice. But yes, in my presentation or in my research, I do not have any specific Buddhist response to cholera. But as I said, the cat talisman is one common example, non-Buddhist example, but very likely things like the one that I showed, the first example, right, from this long, short text, 신주경, I wouldn't be surprised that it was used in the 19th century when things such as cholera, occurred.
Thank you. Oh, we missed one question. So we question from Jenny Pasik. So she's asking, sorry about that. In addition to Buddhist mantras being used as talismans, you also mentioned an image of a cat being used to treat cholera. So I wonder to what extent was the content of the talismans rooted in everyday practice, everyday experiences?
Yeah, I guess that's interesting question. So I think I explained quite a bit about the cat talisman, so probably not necessarily repeat what I said, but what I take from Jenny's question is the contents of talismans, right, rooted in everyday experience. At least in Buddhist context, the contents of talismans are often not necessarily tied with everyday experience, but still kind of easy way to engage. In other words, like mantras, in other words, incantations, right? Some in Indian culture where Buddhism strongly has its root in, has very different ideas about the sonic qualities of our language. In other words, certain sounds has more power than you think. So we have talismans, two different types, right? So I've shown one type, and the one example was that, second example, and the 1, 3, 4 was the other example. But so I just want to make sure that like the unique aspects of Buddhist talismans, and in other and in it, that the dharani or incantation, the sonic qualities were able to be captured or materialized in this written form, and those were more easier, more accessible for people to incorporate into their daily life. That's kind of what I've been trying to say in this talk.
Thank you. We have, I think, one more question. So some Shila Dharani were linked with very philosophically complex auto commentaries. For example, the Heinsa Meron. How does one view these in relation to the very brief mantra associated with puja that you presented?
Yes, Shila Dharanis. So we sort of have to understand the bigger picture here to answer Walter's question. So he's talking. So, but one example, I mostly focused on Chosön period talismans, but also know that during the epidemics, like Samguk Yusa and Samguk Sagi mentions this figure, mythic figure called Chosön. You probably heard of his name when you taught, Shilla history, but basically it's a son of Eastern Sea dragon, and he had this benevolence, and which led him to be a figure that even the demon, epidemic demon, came to be afraid of. So that since then, in the 9th century in Korea, people pasted a picture, the face of Chosön, as a apotropic means to make sure that epidemic gods do not enter from outside. There was a kind of spatial sort of, people had the idea that evil spirits or epidemics or disease coming from outside to inside. So often doors, right, are the where you put those talismans or above the beams of your house, so that it kind of from coming up down. So it's kind of, there's more kind of this idea of outer to in, and also from up and down. But anyways, so that definitely, we have long history of those use of talismans, either written or either drawn. But I think Walter's question is also more about certain teachings of the Buddha, or especially the Avatamsaka Sutra, which is Hwamgyong in Korea, seems to have some particular. I think you are talking about the Yusang, right? Heinsammedo, that kind of very enigmatic sort of arrangement of certain words, and that has actually, that particular image is found in one of the talisman books that I encountered at the Heinsa temple. So yes, that is actually being used in the late Joseon period, the seal that we are, that Walter is talking about. So there is certain magical qualities of certain mysteriously or carefully or very visually interestingly arranged words taken from the popular Buddhist texts are having its own life as a talisman. So yes, I think I will say I will leave it there.
Okay, thank you, baby. I know we have one more minute, but I have one last question to ask. So, Sujang, one of the slides that you shared, there was a list of list of situations when people relied on talismans, and one of them, which drew my attention, was that they used it in order to avoid litigations. And I thought that was fascinating. And so, I'm just wondering, whether what you presented today, is it a chapter of your, I think you mentioned that it was a chapter of your book, but is your book, does it focus on epidemics more broadly, or does each different chapters cover different issues? So if you could talk more about your, a book in general, if you're covering other themes in other chapters, I would love to know. And of course, I very much look forward to reading your book when it's out. And also maybe perhaps related to this chapter, if you could also kind of elaborate on your understanding of healing, the concept of healing in the Chosön context. Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you for the excellent question. And I knew that you were interested in that topic too. The litigation part. And actually, I've seen some talismans when you have some local legal disputes. There were actually different talismans used to basically deter the other side to, drop his lawsuit and that kind of thing. So really, it's really fascinating to the versatility of talismans and how it has been really studied systematically. So, and maybe starting with the concept of healing question first. Yes, it's healing, or especially healing in Buddhism, has been recently sort of a buzzy word, at least in the study of Buddhism. So I guess my focus is try not to be caught by this. In Buddhism, there's such a thing called magical healing, right? So, and magic and religion has very dichotomy. In the previous scholarship, I think there are a lot of debates around these very loaded terms such as healing, magic, religion, right? So I guess for the interest time, so those things are explained in my introduction chapter. So more big conceptual ideas about those dichotomies and sort of genealogies of those like concepts. And then moving on, the first chapter is about broader history, although my example is mostly taken from Chosön periods because we have so many examples. But in the chapter 1, I give from Sheila the oldest example all the way to the 20th centuries of talismanic culture, not just Buddhism, but more talisman in Chosön Peninsula. So that's chapter 1. And chapter 2 is the 24 talisman, among which that just mentioned, right there. So those 24 talismans are definitely what people really like to see more in whatever settings, right? It was used for funerals, it was used for wars, right? So many different contexts, but this 24 gave almost all encompassing protection. People like that idea. Instead of you buy one from here, one buy here or there, but just one big one and solve all the problems. So that was really well popularly circulated. So that one chapter is about that. And then chapter 3, that's 3 is the safe childbirth talisman, which is very interesting, but probably I think one of the most precarious things that people in Chosön period, both Buddhists and Confucians, right? Having a male heir was big deal, right? So this safe birth talisman was really well used. So I kind of go into more in depth about the history and where it comes from, and I make some more transnational connection to China as well. So that's chapter 3. Chapter 4 is this epidemic talisman that I presented. And then chapter 5 is another talisman. Just give you very brief. There is such a thing called gu or go in Korean, but gu is basically using the Chinese character worms, 3 worms, and then there's a dish at the bottom. Basically, it's a poison. But in Oriental medicine, some poison can be also medicine too, right? It's kind of ambivalent. So this gu or go, godok in Chosön, throughout the Chosön era, also Ming and Edo Japan, using this go poisoning was highly severely punished crime. But so in Chosön Wangjo Shillok, I counted over 100 times it says stop using go, right? It's that much popular. Anyways, so as an antidote of that gu poisoning, there was gu talisman. So that particular chapter is about this particular sort of healing talisman used in Chosön, and then conclusion. So book is almost done. I'm trying to finish the manuscript, hopefully ends by the end of this year, and then book comes out sometime after that.
Well, thank you. I mean, listening to your chapters, I think I want to read your book even more. Seems like you cover very broad themes related to Buddhist talismans, not just epidemics, but more broad social issues. So thank you so much. With that, I think we're going to conclude, but thank you so much for your fascinating talk, and also thanks to our audience for your very engaging questions. We'll have our last Premodern Korea lecture series in April by Dr. Wenjia Chao, and hope you can also join us again. But today, thanks again, Sujang, for your wonderful talk, and I look forward to reading your book. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. I love all the comments. See you all another time.